11. In order to reconstruct the summer of 1914, when the numb fury of verse-making first came over me, all I really needed to visualize a certain pavilion. There the lank 15-year-old lad I then was sought shelter during a thunderstorm of which there was an inordinate number that July. I dream of my pavilion at least twice a year. As a rule, it appears in my dreams quite independently of their subject matter, which of course may be anything from abduction to zoology. It hangs around, so to speak, with the unobtrusiveness of an artist's signature. I find it clinging to a corner of the dream canvas, or cunningly worked into some ornamental part of the picture. At times, however, it seems to be suspended in the middle distance, a trifle baroque, and yet in tune with the handsome trees, dark fir and bright birch, whose sap one ran through its timber. Wine red and bottle green, and dark blue lozenges of stained glass lend a chapel-like touch to the lattice work of its casements. It is just as it was in my boyhood, a sturdy old wooden structure above a ferny ravine in the older riverside part of Ivera Park, just as it was, or perhaps a little more perfect. In the real thing, some of the glass was missing, crumpled leaves had been swept in by the wind. The narrow little bridge that arched across the gill at its steepest part, with the pavilion rising midway like a coagulated rainbow, was as slippery after a rainy spell as if it had been coated with some dark and sense magic ointment. Etymologically, pavilion and papilio are closely related. Inside there is nothing in the way of furniture except a folding table hinged restfully to the wall under the east window. Through the 2 or 3 glassless or pale-glassed compartments of which, among the bloated blues and drunken reds, one could glimpse of the river. On a floorboard at my feet, a dead horsefly lay on its back near the brown remains of a birch ament, and the patches of disintegrating whitewash on the inside of the door had been used by various trespassers for such jottings as "Dasha, Tamara, and Lena have been here," or "Down with Austria." The storm passed quickly. The rain, which had been a mass of violently descending water, wherein the trees writhed and rolled, all reduced at once to oblique lines of silent gold, breaking into short and long dashes against a background of subsiding vegetable agitation. Gulfs of voluptuous blue were expanding between great clouds, heap upon heap of pure white and purplish gray, lepota, Old Russian for stately beauty, moving midst gouache and guano, among the curves of which one could distinguish a mammary illusion or the death mask of a poet. The tennis court was a region of great lakes. Beyond the park, above steaming fields, a rainbow slipped into view. The fields ended in a notched dark border of a remote fir wood. Part of the rainbow went across it, and that section of the forest edge shimmered most magically through the pale green and pink of the iridescent veil drawn before it, a tenderness and a glory that made poor relatives of the rhomboidal colored reflections which the return of sun had brought forth on the pavilion floor. A moment later my first poem began. What touched it off? I think I know. Without any wind blowing, the sheer weight of a raindrop, shining in parasitic luxury on a cordate leaf, caused its tip to dip, and what looked like a globule of quicksilver performed a sudden glissando down the center vein, and then, having shed its bright load, the relieved leaf unbent. Tip, leaf, dip, relief. The instant it all took to happen seemed to me not so much a fraction of time as a fissure in it, a missed heartbeat, which was refunded at once by a powder of rhymes. I say powder intentionally, for when a gust of wind did come, the trees would briskly start to drip all together in a crude imitation of the recent downpour, as the stanza I was already muttering resembled the shock of wonder I had experienced when for a moment heart and leaf had been one. In the avid heat of the early afternoon, but benches, bridges, and bowls, all things in fact save the tennis court, were drying with incredible rapidity, and soon little remained of my initial inspiration. Although these bright fissures had closed, I doggedly went on composing. My medium happened to be Russian, and could have been just as well Ukrainian, or basic English, or Volapük. The kind of poem I produced in those days was hardly anything more than a sign I made of being alive, or passing, or having passed, or hoping to pass, through certain intense human emotions. It was a phenomenon of orientation rather than of art, thus comparable to stripes of paint on a roadside rock or a pillared heap of stones marking a mountain trail. But then, in a sense, all poetry is positional. To try to express one's position in regard to the universe embraced by a consciousness and an immemorial urge. The arms of consciousness reach out and grope, and the longer they are, the better. Tentacles, not wings, are Apollo's natural members. Vivian Bloodmark, a philosophical friend of mine in later years, used to say that while the scientist sees everything that happens in one point of space, the poet feels everything that happens in one point of time. Lost in thought, he taps his knee with a wand-like pencil, and at the same instant a car, New York license plate, passes along the road. A child bangs the screen door of a neighboring porch. An old man yawns in a misty Turkestan orchard. A granule of cinder-gray sand is rolled by the wind of Venus. A Dr. Jacques Hirsch in Grenoble puts on his reading glasses, and trillions of other such trifles occur, all forming an instantaneous and transparent organism of events, of which the poet sitting in a lawn chair at Ithaca, New York, is the nucleus. That summer I was still far too young to evolve any wealth of cosmic synchronization. To quote my philosopher again, but I did discover at least that a person hoping to become a poet must have the capacity of thinking of several things at a time. In the course of the languid rambles that accompanied the making of my first poem, I ran into the village schoolmaster, an ardent socialist, a good man, intensely devoted to my father. I welcomed this image, always with a tight posy of wild flowers, always smiling, always perspiring. While politely discussing with him my father's sudden journey to town, I registered simultaneously and with equal clarity not only his wilting flowers, his flowering tie, his black-headish on the flattishy volutes of his nostrils, but also the dull little voice of a cuckoo coming from afar, and the flash of a queen of Spain settling on the road, and the remembered impression of the pictures enlarged agricultural pests and bearded Russian riders in the well-aerated classrooms of the village school which I had once or twice visited, and to continue a tabulation that hardly does justice to the ethereal simplicity of the whole process, the throb of some utterly irrelevant recollection of pedometer I had lost was released from a neighboring brain cell, and the savor of the grass stalk I was chewing mingled with the cuckoo's note and fritillary's take-off, and all the while I was richly, serenely aware of my own manifold awareness. He beamed and he bowed, in the effusive manner of Russian radical, and took a couple of steps backward and turned and jauntily went on his way, and I picked up the thread of my poem. During the short time I had been otherwise engaged, something seemed to have happened to such words as I was already strung together. They did not look quite as lustrous as they had before the interruption. Some suspicions crossed my mind that I might be dealing in dummies. Fortunately, this cold twinkle of critical perception did not last. The fervor I had been trying to render took over again and brought its medium back to illusory life. The ranks of words I received were again so glowing, with their puffed-out little chests and trim uniforms, that I put down to mere fancy the sagging I had noticed out of the corner of my eye. Apart from the credulous inexperience, a young Russian versificator had to hope with a special handicap. In contrast to the rich vocabulary of satirical or narrative verse, the Russian elegy suffered from a bad case of verbal anemia. Only in very expert hands could it be made to transcend its humble origin, the pallid poetry of the 18th century France. True, in my day a new school was in the act of ripping up the old rhymes, but it was still to the latter that the conservative beginner turned in search of a neutral instrument, possibly because he did not wish to be diverted from the simple expression of simple emotions by the adventures of a hazardous form. Form, however, got its revenge. The rather monotonous designs into which early 19th century Russian poets had twisted the pliant elegy resulted in certain words or types of words, such as the Russian equivalents of Folomor or Langaro et Ravant, being coupled again and again, and this latter lyricist could not shake off for a whole century. An especially obsessive arrangement peculiar to the iambic of 4 to 6 feet, a long wriggly adjective would occupy the first of 5 syllables of the last 3 feet of the line. A good tetramic example would be Terpi be Gileni Muki, endure incalculable tournaments. The young Russian poet was liable to slide with a fatal ease into this alluring abyss of syllables. For the illustration which I have chosen, Beshileni, only because it translates well, the real favorites were such typical elegiac components as Zadumichivi, pensive, Ultrashini, lost, Muchitilini, anguished, and so forth, all accented on the second syllable. Despite its great length, a word of that kind had but a single accent of its own, and consequently the penultimate metrical stress of the line encountered is normally unstressed syllable, ni, in the Russian example, la, in the English one. This produced a pleasant scud, which however was much too familiar in effect to redeem banality of meaning. An innocent beginner, I fell into the traps laid by a singing epithet. Not that I did not struggle. In fact, I was working at my elegy very hard, taking endless trouble over every line, choosing and rejecting, rolling the words on my tongue with the glazed eye solemnity of a tea-taster. And still it would come, that atrocious betrayal. The frame impelled the picture, the husk shaped the pulp. The hackneyed order of words, short verb of pronoun, long adjective, short noun, engendered the hackneyed disorder of thought, and some such line as poeta grossier griolzi, translatable and accented to the poet's melancholy of daydreams, led fatally to a rhyming line ending in rosy, roses, or briolzi, birches, or grolzi, thunderstorms, so that certain emotions were connected with certain surroundings, not by free act of one's will, but by the faded ribbon of tradition. Nonetheless, the nearer my poem got to its completion, the more certain I became that whatever I saw before me would be seen by others. As I focused my eyes upon a kidney-shaped flower bed, and noted one pink petal lying on the loam, and a small ant investigating its decayed edge, or considered the tanned midriff of a birch trunk under some hoodlum that striped of its pepper and salt bark, I really believed that all this would be perceived by the reader through the magic veil of my words, such as Oltrestini Rosi, or Zudumchivoi Birolzi. It did not occur to me then that far from being a veil, those poor words were so opaque that in fact they formed a wall in which one could distinguish where the well-worn bits of the major and minor poets I imitated. Years later, in the squalid suburb of a foreign town, I remember seeing appalling the boards which had been brought from some other place where they had been used apparently as the enclosure of the itinerant circus. Animals had been painted on it by a versatile barker, but whoever had removed the boards and then knocked them together again must have been blind or insane, for now the fence showed only disjointed parts of animals, some of them moreover upside down, a tawny hunch, a zebra's head, a leg of an elephant. On the physical plane, my intense labors were marked by a number of dim actions and postures, such as walking, sitting, lying. Each of these was broken again into fragments of no spatial importance. At the walking stage, for instance, I might be wandering one moment into the depths of the park, and the next pacing the rooms of the house, or to take the sitting stage, I would suddenly become aware that a plate of something I could not even remember having sampled was being removed, that my mother, her left cheek twitching as it did whenever she was worried, was narrowly observing from her place at the top of a long table my moodiness and lack of appetite. I would lift my head to explain, but the table had gone, and I was sitting alone on a roadside stump, the stick of my butterfly net in a metronomic motion, drawing arc after arc on the brownish sand, earth and rainbows, with variations of depth as strokes rendering different colors. When I was irrevocably committed to finish my poem or die, there came a most trance-like state of awe. With hardly a twinge of surprise, I found myself of all places on a leathern couch of the cold, musty, little-used room that had been my grandfather's study. On that couch I lay prone in a kind of reptilian freeze, one arm dangling, so that my knuckles loosely touched the floral figures of the carpet. Next I came out of the trance. The greenish flora was still there, my arm was still dangling, but now I was prostrate on the edge of a rickety wharf, and the water lilies I touched were real, and the undulating plump shadows of an alder foliage on the water, apothecized inkblots, oversized amoebas, were rhythmically palpitating, extending and drawing in the dark pseudopods, which, when contracted, would break at their rounded margins to elusive and fluid macules, and these would come together again to reshape in groping terminals. I relapsed into the private mist, and when I emerged again, the support of my extended body became a low bench in the park, and the life shadows among which my hand dipped now moved on the ground among violet trims, instead of an aqueous black and green. So little did ordinary measures of existence mean that in state I would not have been surprised to come out of its tunnel right into the park of the Versailles, or the Tea Garden, or the Sequoia National Forest. And inevitably when old trance occurs nowadays, I am quite prepared to find myself, when I awaken from it, high up in a certain tree above the dappled bench of my boyhood, my belly pressed against the thick, comfortable bench, and one arm hanging down among the leaves upon which the shadows or other leaves move. Various sounds reach me in various situations. It might be the dinner gong or something less usual, such as the foul music of a barrel organ. Somewhere near the stables the old tramp would grind, and on the strength of more direct impressions inscribed in earlier years, I would see him mentally from my perch. Painted on the front of his instrument were balkan peasants of some dancing among palmoid willows. Every now and then he shifted the crank from one hand to the other. I saw the jersey and skirt of a little bald female monkey, her collar, the raw sore on her neck, the chain that she kept plucking at every time the man pulled it, hurting her badly, and the several servants standing round, gaping, grinning, simple folks terribly tickled by a monkey's antics. Only the other day, near the place where I am recording these matters, I came across a farmer and his son, the kind of keen, healthy kid you see in a breakfast food ads, who are similarly diverted by the sight of a young cat torturing a baby chipmunk, letting him run a few inches and then pouncing upon him again. Most of his tail had gone, the stump was bleeding, and he could not escape by running. The game little fellow tried one last measure. He stopped and lay down on his side in order to merge with a bit of light and shade on the ground, but the too violent heaving of his flank gave him away. The family photograph, which the advent of the evening set in action, was another musical machine I could hear through my verse. On the veranda where our relatives and friends assembled, it emitted from its brace mouthpiece the so-called Tsigankia romancy. Beloved of my generation, these were more or less anonymous imitations of gypsy songs, or imitations of such imitations which constituted their gypsiness, was a deep monotonous moan broken by a kind of hiccup, the audible cracking of lovesick heart at their best. They were responsible for a raucous note, vibrating here and there in the works of true poets. I am thinking especially of Alexander Blok. At their worst, they could be likened to the Apache stuff, composed by mild men of letters and delivered by the thick-set lady in Parisian nightclubs. Their natural environment was characterized by nightingales in tears, lilacs in bloom, and alleys whispering trees that graced the parks of the landed gentry. These nightingales trilled in a pine grove setting, they bended their tones to different levels with fiery red. A tambourine still throbbing seemed to lie in the darkening moss. For a spell, the last notes of the husky contralto pursued me through the dusk. Then the silence returned. My first poem was ready. It was indeed a miserable concoction, containing many borrowings besides its pseudo-Pushkinian modulations. An echo of Turgenev's thunder and a refracted sunbeam from Vett were alone excusable. For the rest, I vaguely remember the mention of memory's sting, Volspinium Jalo, which I really visualized as the ovipositor of an ichneumon fly straddling a cabbage caterpillar, but had not dared to say so, and something about the old world charm of a distant barrel-like organ. Worst of all were the shameful gleanings from Putin's and Grand Duke Konstantin's lyrics of Tsigansky type. They used to be persistently pressed upon me by a youngish and rather attractive aunt who could also spout Louis Boillet's famous piece, une femme, in which a metaphorical violin bow is incongruously used to play a metaphorical guitar, and lots of stuff by Ella Wheeler Wilcox. A tremendous hit with the Empress and her ladies-in-waiting. It seems hardly worthwhile to add that as themes go, my eulogy dealt with the loss of a beloved mistress, Delia, Tamara, or Lenore, whom I had never lost, never loved, never met, and was still all of it set to meet, love, and lose. In my foolish innocence, I believed that what I had written was a beautiful and wonderful thing. As I carried it homeward, still unwritten, but so complete that even its punctuation marks were impressed on my brain like a pillow crease on a sleeper's flesh, I did not doubt that my mother would greet my achievement with glad tears of pride. The possibility of her being much too engrossed that particular night in other events to listen to verse did not enter my mind at all. Never in my life had I craved more for her praise. Never had I been more vulnerable. My nerves were on edge because of the darkness of the earth, which I had not noticed muffling itself up, and the nakedness of the firmament, and the disrobing of which I had not noticed either. Overhead, between the formless trees and bordering my dissolving path, the night sky was pale with stars. In those years, the marvelous mess of constellations, nebulae, interstellar gaps, and all the rest of the awesome show provoked in me an indescribable sense of nausea, of utter panic, as if I were hanging from Earth upside down on the brink of infinite space with terrestrial gravity still holding me by the heels and about to release me at any moment. Except for 2 corner windows on the upper story, my mother's sitting room, the house was already dark. The night watchman let me in, and slowly, carefully, so as not to disturb the arrangement of words my aching head, I mounted the stairs. My mother reclined on the sofa with the St. Petersburg wreck in her hands, and an open London Times in her lap. A white telephone gleamed on the grass-topped table near her. Late as it was, she still kept expecting my father to call from St. Petersburg, where he was being detained by the tension of approaching war. An armchair stood by the sofa, but I always avoided it because of its golden satin, the mere sight of which caused a fascinate shiver to branch from my spine like a nocturnal lightning. With a little cough, I sat down on a footstool and started my recitation. While thus engaged, I kept staring at the farther wall, upon which I see so clearly in retrospect some small daguerreotypes in silhouettes and oval frames. A mauve aquarelle, young birch trees, the half of a rainbow, everything very melting and moist, a splendid Versailles autumn of Alexander Benoit, and a crayon drawing my mother's mother had made in her girlhood, that park pavilion, again with its pretty windows, partly screened by linked branches. The Slomov and the Benoits were now in some Soviet museum. But that pavilion will never be nationalized. As my memory hesitated for a moment on the threshold of the last stanza, where so many opening words had been tried, that the finally selected one was now somewhat camouflaged by an array of false entrances, I heard my mother sniff. Presently I finished reciting and looked up at her. She was smiling ecstatically through the tears that streamed down her face. "How wonderful, how beautiful," she said. And with the tenderness in her smile still growing, she passed me a hand mirror so that I might see the smear of blood on my cheekbone, where at some indeterminate time I had crushed a gorged mosquito by the unconscious act of propping my cheek on my fist. But I saw more than that. Looking into my own eyes, I had the shocking sensation of finding the mere dregs of my usual self, odds and ends of an evaporated identity, which I took my reason quite an effort to gather again in the glass. The author in Cambridge, spring 1920. It was not unnatural for a Russian, when gradually discovering the pleasures of the camp, to prefer at first a rowboat to the more proper canoe or punt.